I'm joined now by, and I'll just move a bit here. I'm joined now by Robert from Montagu Evans and Tom Davies from Bloom Development to talk about ultra-urban warehousing. Let's start with Robert, just as a very quick summary on where you're coming from, what you do, and your take on the warehousing for last mile.
Yeah, so thanks, Nick, for having me. So I'm working at Montagu Evans, so I work predominantly in London in the digital agency and on the leasing side as well as development. So we're doing that for sort of 3 to 4 years. So have seen a lot of the rapid growth that we've had. I mean, obviously the growth that we had at the start of the year and even throughout COVID was quite exceptional in the way online retail sort of skyrocketed from quite a relatively sort of not stagnant but a slower growth, sort of taking out almost in excess of 35% of all retail sales to a more sustainable level now. I think it's still in quite a good place. We're sort of seeing quite a lot on the ground, but occupiers are still out looking for these last mile, really ultra urban locations in zones 1 and 2, because fundamentally there's not really much supply and there hasn't been over recent years. So, I mean, from our point of view and what we're seeing, that even if as the world gets a little bit tougher and impacts of inflation and interest rates hit consumer spending, and that means demand might tail off a bit, supply is so constrained in these locations that there's still going to be a relatively good level of demand. There's still probably going to be a supply and demand imbalance, which is good for people like us and people like Tom at Bloom.
And Tom, coming up to you, is it really hard to find a place? And I know you're also working at Bloom on some quite interesting projects in this area.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me and Rob, Nick. So I'm one of the co-founders of Bloom, and we are an investment and development manager focused on what we've termed ultra-urban warehousing, which, just for those that aren't necessarily aware, is basically inner city warehousing. So we're talking non-traditional locations for warehousing, comparatively to the more traditional locations like Park Royal or Enfield or Croydon or Barking or Dagenham, where warehouses are traditionally located. We're all about putting warehousing in locations where the end consumer is right in that proximity. It's very localized warehousing. In terms of what's going on in the market at the moment, I think it's a very unusual time. The last 5 months from an investment standpoint, off the back of supply chain issues and the terrible war that's going on right now in Ukraine and Russia, as well as the inflationary environment and interest rates and other factors, have meant there's been this kind of dislocation in the sector where there's really strong fundamentals for the need for more warehousing space off the back of what Robert mentioned earlier, being e-commerce, as well as digitalization, technological adoption, and what we're really focused on, which is the need for speed. And that is the end consumer driving the consumption of goods and services at real speed. And to be fair, Amazon, the Amazon effect has been a big cause of that. Them offering better and better delivery timescales, windows, types of delivery, location where they can deliver, etc. And we're now seeing consumers want stuff now. So you've got these really strong fundamentals of demand side increasing in the sector because more and more occupiers are needing space to be able to cater to those end consumer and end businesses needs, as well as in London, particularly a supply side environment that is shrinking every year due to the loss of industrial lands in London to high value uses such as residential. And it is a tricky one for local government and kind of regional government, given we are in a housing crisis, but we do need warehouses to continue delivering goods and services to the growing population in London. In terms of the current state of the market, investment market is pretty quiet, and I think we're going to talk about this in due course. There is still a large amount of capital looking for opportunities, but it's not quite clear where current market pricing or valuations sit. Which means that a lot of investors seem to be kind of taking a bit of a break and just assessing opportunities and hopefully waiting for that market pricing to settle when investment volumes start increasing again. And when that does happen, we think due to the strong conviction of the fundamentals in the sector, we should return to some form of normal in terms of investment volumes. In terms of the occupational market, a lot of people are reporting that it is still performing very strongly. I think we share a view that we have a slightly different view. We think it is still performing strongly, but not as strongly as perhaps it was. And we don't really agree with the fact that it's going to continue to boom as much as it was doing, given we're going to a recessionary environment where unfortunately businesses are going to come into a position of either having to contract and reduce expansion, some potentially going bust, unfortunately, and obviously consumers drawing down their spending or clawing back their spending is going to impact business growth and therefore occupational demand.
I also want to, in a way, to paint the picture of these facilities. Is it going to be new facilities, or just in a way whatever people can find and just serves the needs? How does it look when we're talking about ultra urban and where the consumers are living? As you mentioned, specifically in London, there isn't that much space to find, even to build something new as a housing development, let alone a warehouse.
Yeah, I think it's starting to change. So, I mean, traditionally, a lot of the inner London stuff, maybe it wasn't purpose built, or hadn't been recently, wasn't built to a great spec. I mean, a lot of the people like Bloom, Seagrow, and the likes of Valor, who are trying to build higher spec stuff into London, are improving the specification of those units and trying to get those returns. I mean, what's quite interesting is recently British Land, so they're trying to reuse some of their existing estate in Paddington, which is in Zone 1, and do 127,000 square feet of a basement level industrial, and they bought an NCP car park in Finsbury Circus rather for the same purpose, to do underground logistics in Zone 1. So they'll service those only by sort of electric bikes and those sort of EV cargo bikes that you see. So that'll be quite interesting to see how that goes, and that's be a higher quality spec than what's already there, and it's a lot more space than's been there. So that will sort of leads back to what Doddle was saying on the sustainability piece. If that amount of space is available in Zone 1, it's only going to improve the sustainability of last mile logistics.
But just speaking on the word of electric bikes, everything that has electric in it means that the environment around it has to be also transformed, quite literally. How hard is this? It's not just finding the building. You have to find the energy, then you have to find all the infrastructure around it and make sure that it doesn't blow up because there is not enough energy.
Yeah, I mean that's an ongoing battle. I mean there was news of the lack of power in Park Royal because it's all gone to data centres, halting residential development. It's an ongoing issue, I think, in London. I'm not quite sure what the solution is or how far progressed they are, but
yeah, I think just to add to that, I completely agree with the infrastructure point around electrified fleets. I think the other thing that it's worth kind of mentioning, because we're speaking to quite a few planning authorities at the moment on some of our schemes, is it's not just about electric bikes, but also other forms of non-combustion vehicle using different types of fuel that is more sustainable, and also using push bikes and also pedestrians to deliver on foot. Amazon are opening a facility, the London City Wall car park near the Barbican, where they're going to be using pedestrians to actually deliver parcels. And the beauty of having the facility closer to the end consumer is shorter delivery distances, which takes larger vehicles coming into the city centres from more traditional industrial locations further out, but it also reduces the distance per parcel delivery, and therefore the impact reduces the amount of carbon emissions and the impact on air quality per parcel delivery by using these smaller vehicles as well.
Who are these facilities for when you're talking about parcels? Is it specifically, obviously today we're talking about e-commerce last mile, but is it specifically for smaller items, groceries, or are we going to expect to see something more larger?
I think it's varied. So you're looking, some of the operators that seemingly are taking more central London space are still delivering next day. Packfleet is a good example of that. They're a new startup, kind of a mini DPD, who are looking to take more central sites in London to deliver next day, whereas there are other operators that are looking to deliver faster than that. So, I think Zedify are a good example, Pedal Me as well. These guys are delivering goods kind of same day and more instantly at certain points. But yeah, it's a bit of a varied effect at the moment in the market.
Yeah, so you had a lot of investment into sort of the rapid grocery delivery occupiers, and that's probably calmed down a bit more. But I think one of the knock-on effects from that is like the occupiers Tom mentioned, as a company we lease the building to in Hoxton called Bodo, who are trying to do a very similar model, slightly slower delivery times, probably half an hour to an hour, but for more traditional sort of higher margin retail goods. And those might well be the occupiers that take those zone one locations because how they need to be as close as they can be to the end consumer.
And just as a bit later, we're going to talk about quick commerce. And one of the problems, I think, quite visible in Amsterdam specifically was how unhappy people are with such ultra-urban warehouses, whether they're dark stores or light stores, whatever they might be called. What is the role of authorities and companies in trying to make this possible?
It's a big question. Quite a complex one. I think I agree that you've got to make sure that where we're putting these buildings and industrial kind of estates is done sensitively in terms of the neighbouring amenity and uses you have in a certain location. I think we are purely focused on these more central locations and kind of our Camberwell site that we own, as well as our Brixton site, our Hackney site, our Fulham site. They're all surrounded by residents on the doorstep. So we're trying to think very collaboratively and work very closely with the local authorities to ensure that we're building, estates that, crucially are there to deliver the goods and services that those very consumers want. But we need to make sure we're delivering the buildings, with their amenity in mind, whether that's, how you configure the estate to limit potential nuisance disruption from noise or smell, whether or not it's, how you look to avoid, having kind of significant impact on the local road network in terms of vehicle movements, how you're looking at actually operating and managing the estates once they're built and ensuring that the local authorities are comfortable with your approach, are all considerations that we're discussing with various authorities at the moment. But we've had some really positive responses from residents as well that are happy to see older style industrial estates reinvigorated with modern design, improved sustainability, and ultimately they're delivering the goods and services that these guys need.
And finally, as a sort of closing, you both mentioned we're entering into recession. Probably the market is not going to do as well as before or expected. Can we talk about what are your expectations moving forward? Not just about the ultra-urban, but also in the larger macroeconomic.
Tough question. I mean, it inevitably might well get a bit harder as consumer spending gets hit when people go back into the mortgage market to remortgage us after the sort of interest rate hikes. It won't be as steep as they have been. I mean, luckily for me and maybe Tom, we focus on London, so I really only work in London and the southeast. It's kind of fortunately a little bit insulated, so might well be the first to bounce back if there is a sharp recession. I mean, as you saw with all the investment in the Q-commerce sector, all of that started in London. The heaviest investment were there because if their logic is, and it found that in fact really is, if they can crack London, then that's a really good starting point to start from, because there's obviously a lot more density of population, and unfortunately the vast majority of London is far more affluent than the rest. So I think it might well get a bit more challenging. I think the rental growth aspirations we're never going to keep up with what we saw in 2020 and the 2021 and the first half of 2022. But I think there'll still be good rental growth there, because fundamentally the fundamentals are good. And if, as Tom says, and as we've seen, the development market slows down a little bit, that's only going to negatively impact supply in an already supply constrained market.
Yeah, no, ditto what Robert's just said there. I think the occupational market we believe will still perform well, not at the heights it did, but I think when we look at the rental growth stats for 2021, which take into account all industrial in Greater London, I think the rental growth is 15.9% that year. Now, I think the interesting thing about that is it's taking into all assets. If you actually look at really high quality assets, the rental growth rate was higher, in a lot of instances than that. In Canning Town, Seagrove bought an estate in 2021. Average rent was around 20 quid. They agreed 29 quid that same year. It's pretty much nearly a 50% increase. And we've kind of seen that versus where we've underwritten assets versus now where we're having conversations with occupiers, the flight to quality we think is going to be really important in the recessionary environment. And we also believe that, we're now having conversations with a wide variety of occupiers where ESG is really at the forefront of their need and their requirement. And that is a trend that is continuing in the market. And if you look at London generally, due to the lack of available supply as it is, there's not a huge amount of brand new, high quality, sustainable product coming into the market. And we believe for that type of product is going to be, particularly strong demand, and therefore you should see, outperformance versus the rest of the market. And that's generally what we're trying to focus on.
Well, Robert, Tom, thank you very much. We will continue our conversations as well with Bloom and Montagu Evans later this month and into the new year.